Hi Year 9, welcome back. I hope you had a lovely half term. We're going to jump straight into a new project today, focusing on smartphone photography. Before we get started on today's lesson, I want to bring your attention to a worksheet which you should complete before this video. So if you haven't completed it yet, pause the video, head over to Teams, complete the worksheet. It should take you about 15 minutes. There's only 4 questions, but there's a mix of methods. So I want you to write some answers down. There's also a quiz and online answers as well. So pause the video, head over to Teams and just check that you've done all those questions first. Like I said, it should take you about 15 minutes. Don't spend too long on it, and then come back to the video for the rest of the lesson. Our aims for today's lesson is to introduce the fundamental components of photography, and we're going to do this by discussing the technical elements, different genres and key factors to consider when creating our photographs. We're then going to look further into these elements during the lesson by putting them into practice while exploring the functions and settings within our smartphone cameras. And we're going to produce a series of photo tasks focusing on composition and lighting. So for this lesson, you're going to need a paper and pen or a device to take notes digitally, a camera, and this can either be on your smartphone or tablet, a good space to work in, and a chosen object to photograph, but I'll talk more about that later in the lesson. So you should have all seen the worksheet by now. I just want to talk us through the questions. Firstly, I wanted you to write down 3 things you need to consider before taking a successful photograph. Then there's a quiz to test your knowledge on different genres of photography. I'd also like you to write down which particular genres inspire you. Are there any photographers in particular? Jot those down, it's good to see. Then there's also a link to submit answer to question 3. What makes a photograph successful, eye-catching and interesting? Make sure you follow the link and add your answers, because I'll be sharing those answers next week, so it's good to get as much impact as we can for that question. And lastly, jot down if there's anything you want to learn in particular from this project. Question 1. There's loads of things we can consider before even pressing a button to take a successful photo. I've included a few on the screen now. Firstly, exposure. If we're working on a DSLR camera, then you would need to know about how we control how much light gets into the camera. We do this with the shutter speed, the light sensitivity, the aperture. Luckily for us, we're using smartphones, and they're smart. So it's all done for us, but exposure is definitely a fundamental part of photography and it's worth noting it. There's also a lot of elements we can control with a smartphone, like the focus. We choose what is blurred and what's sharp. There's the composition, which is completely in our control. There's light, because we decide the source of light and how it causes shadows and contrast within our image. There's the angle, we control where we take the photo from. All these elements are what we are in control, and it's about us making the most of our camera. So our decisions on each of these elements will impact the way the final image looks. You should have already completed the quiz for question 2. It's a Kahoot quiz, so you should be familiar with them. It looks a bit like this on the screen. This quiz includes 9 questions and it should take you less than 5 minutes to complete. So if you haven't done it yet, please follow the link and complete it now. I'd like someone to try and beat my score. In case you didn't already know, genre is just a style or category. So that quiz focused on different styles of photography, and it should have just opened your eyes to just how many different types of photography there are out there. That quiz should have really opened your mind to how vast the world of photography is. There are so many different genres for us to be aware of. During this project, we are focusing on smartphone photography, but that doesn't mean to say that we are limited in what we can achieve. We can take influence from any style of photography that inspires us and recreate elements of these within our smartphone photos. We should be able to show the way in which we see the world through our eyes within our images. So I want you to be aware of the different styles of photography out there and bring these into your own work whenever possible. For question 3, I need you to follow the link and submit your answers through a website. This is important as we're going to share the answers in our next lesson. So make sure you add them. You can submit your answers anonymous if you want, but it's good to get all the words there so we've got them for next lesson. So please make sure you do that. That completes the worksheet. I look forward to seeing your answers to those. Now we're going to move on to our photo tasks, and this part of the lesson is made up of 6 different photo tasks, and we will photograph one object and focus on different elements of photography during each task. Each task should take you around 5 to 10 minutes, and during this time I want you to really think about your cameras and how we use them. I'm going to break down each task and we'll work through them together. Some top tips before we get started on today's photo tasks. Firstly, clean your lens. This is to make sure nothing compromises the quality of your photo. Then put your device on aeroplane mode. It's so easy to get distracted, so let's just remove those distractions. It won't last long and you can knock it back on once you've finished. Then knock your flash off. Today we're just going to be working with natural lighting, so there's no need for a flash. Lastly, pick an interesting object to photograph. I've chosen a bunch of daffodils because that's what I had, but you can pick anything you have available to you. A toy, some fruit, a vase, a perfume bottle, an ornament, anything. Just find something you want to photograph. We're starting off our photo tasks with a nice easy theme, which is just getting to know our camera. So for this one, I'd like us all to go through the functions on our camera. Now every camera is going to be a bit different. Every phone will have different settings, but they're going to be basically the same elements included. I'm going to take you through my phone. I've got a Huawei phone, and obviously they might alter from phone to phone, but they should look pretty much the same. And I want us to pick out 3 camera functions and just have a think about why they're different and what difference they make. Then I'm going to ask you to pick out your favourite function and write a bit of notes to explain why they're your favourites. So let's have a little look on the functions we can control within our camera. Firstly, you can everything I said earlier about the technical side of it, like the exposure, your phone does it for you, but you do have an element control, which is what I'm playing with now. You can slide the exposure up to make it more exposed, and you can slide it down to make it underexposed. This is good if you've got shadowy areas you'd like to get more exposed, like the stems on the daffodils. I'd like to have them lighter, and I'm not worried about losing detail in the background, so that works. I'm on the aperture setting now, and a lower aperture is giving me a blurred background. 2.4, that's low, whereas the higher one give it all in focus. So just play about with that. That's quite technical, you don't need to understand it yet, but it's good to know you've got the ability to control it on your phone. This is also achievable in portrait mode, where you can focus on something in the foreground and it blurs out the background. And that blurred effect is called depth of field, which is a good option to have. So now I'm just using the basic photo mode. You can see it's a really wide angle on that. It fits loads on the screen. I've also experimented with HDR. So those are my 3 functions that I really wanted to just get to know. Here are my 3 images from the 3 different camera functions. Firstly, I experimented with the aperture. You don't really need to understand this for this lesson, but the higher the aperture, the more in focus your image is going to be. So if you look at the roof in the background of the first image, you can see that roof is just as sharp as the reflection of the vase in the foreground of the first image. So it's all pin sharp, which is a really good option to have on our cameras. Secondly, I experimented with the portrait mode, which gives me a completely opposite effect to that really sharp pinpoint effect in the first image. Instead, if you look at the roof in the background on the second image, it's a big blur, which is a really good option to have on our camera. And then lastly, I experimented with the HDR, which is a high dynamic range function. And this basically means that the camera will take a few images and put them all together to make the best exposed image. My favourite out of these three functions for this image is probably going to be the portrait one, and that's just because I don't like the background and it blurs the background out. So I think that's the function best suited for this particular image. Now, our second task focuses on composition, and all composition means is how we arrange the elements within the frame to make them look good. And composition is a huge topic, but today we're just thinking about the rule of thirds. So let me explain the rule of thirds to you a bit. The rule of thirds breaks down the frame into thirds, both horizontally and vertically. And this grid helps us to place the elements to film our frame in a dynamic way. We can use the 4 intersecting points of the grid to help us place our subject, as these are the points where the viewer's eyes are naturally drawn to. So we're going to be using this grid to help us. So first we're going to avoid putting our object in the middle of the frame. This might feel like the natural thing to do, but we're going to avoid it for this task. Instead, we're going to put it on one of the intersecting points. We're really lucky that our phones includes the function of the grid to assist us with this task. So our first step would be to go into our settings on our camera and just add the assistive grid. Once we've got the assistive grid, we can then use that to help us place the most interesting part of our object and place it on one of those intersecting points. So you can see here that I've experimented with different parts of the flowers. I thought maybe the stem might be interesting, but then I thought no, I prefer the head of the daffodil instead. And you can just rearrange. The composition means how the elements look within the frame. So I wanted to rearrange the photos. I weren't happy with the flowers, I weren't happy with how they looked. So a little bit of flower arranging, replaced it on the intersecting point, and then took my photo. Here's my final image for the task focusing on composition. As you can see, I've used the rule of thirds. I wanted to keep the windowsill parallel to the grid of the rule of thirds grid. I just thought this gave it a neater feel. I've also kept the most important part of my object, which is the vase and the flowers, on that intersecting point of the rule of thirds grid. So this has given a dynamic composition, which I'm a lot more happier with. Once we're happy with the composition and how we're filling up that frame, I want us to think about the lighting. What is the source of lighting? It should be natural light. It'll help if you are shooting next to or in front of a nice window, and if you're not already, then go to one and see what difference this makes to your photo. Now I've already experimented with the sunlight as I've shot the flowers directly in front of the windowsill. I found that the light was quite strong and I wanted to experiment with a more subtle light source, so I've moved from the windowsill over to my desk. The window is now behind me, which has created a nice balanced lighting effect. I then finish off by moving around to the side of the flowers. So the window, my light source, is now to the side of the flowers, and this has just created a nice shadow which I actually really like. Here are my 3 images for the lighting task. All 3 images use natural daylight. In the first image, the natural daylight is coming in through the window and is backlighting up my object. So the light is coming from behind the object. In the middle image, the light I've moved to the side of the flowers. So the light is coming in through the window and shining more directly onto the flowers themselves, and that's giving it a more balanced look. The last image is side lighting, where I've moved away from the window, which has given it a more subtle effect already, but I also prefer the side lighting because of the shadows it's made. I like the little reflection given from the vase, and I just think it creates more depth having the highlight one side and the shadow the other side. It just makes it look a bit more dynamic. For our 4th task, I want us to consider the background. Now, I've already subconsciously done the background. From moving from the windowsill to my desk, I've removed the clutter because I didn't like the background from my window images. So by moving to a nice clean empty desk, I've given it a more cleaner finish to the image. So when you were considering your background, I want you to think, is there any clutter in the frame? Is there anything that doesn't need to be there? Remove it. Also think about what's not there. Maybe your background could do with some textures. What colour's your background? Is it going to clash with the subject? You don't want to distract from the main object, or there might be colours that might complement it. So just think about all these factors that come into play within the frame of your photo. Lastly, I want us to consider our position when we are taking our photographs. I want us to move our feet, move the camera, change the angle, and see how they all go into affect the final look of the photo. So you could step away from your subject or your object and include more of the background in the shot, or you could move closer and let your subject fill up the frame. How will it impact the final image? Have a play about with it. You could also try shooting from above, bringing the camera up and looking down, or you could bring the camera down low and look up to your subject. All these are going to have a huge impact on the way your final image looks. So have a play about and experiment and see what works best with your object. Here's 2 examples that I've taken. The first one, I moved my camera high and shot the photograph looking down onto the flowers, which I didn't think worked really well as you lose the depth and the shape of the flowers. I think the second one works much better, and I shot this by placing the camera down low and shooting up towards the vase. Now this gives the flower height, it shows off their shape, and we also get to see the colour in the stems of the water, which creates sort of abstract shapes. So there's a lot more happening here, so I think it works well for my subject, but it might not be the case for your object, so have a play about with it. Which brings us on to our final task. Now we need to put together everything we've learned from the previous tasks. Do you think you can do it? So here's my final image. I've created this by picking my favourite parts from the tasks and I've put them all together. So to recap, I've used the aperture mode to keep the focus sharp throughout the image. If you notice, the flower on the desk is just as sharp as the flower in the background. I've also slightly overexposed this image, and this is so I can keep the detail in even the shadowy areas, including the stems. The natural light is coming in from the side, and I've done this because I like the shadows it creates and also the reflections coming through the water. I've used the rule of thirds and I've kept the main flower on that intersecting point. I've also added the flower on the desk to help fill up the frame, using the grid to help me do that. I've shot from down low, and I've done this to add height to the flowers and so we can see the shape of the flowers and all of the details included in the vase. I've kept my black background plain to make sure the yellow and the green stand out. The white is quite contrasting for these colours. and nothing's going to distract from my subject, as I think there's enough to focus on between the flower heads, the stems, the water in the vase and the shadows. I'm really happy with how they all work together. If I was going to reshoot, I might try to find another surface, as I'm not entirely happy with the line of the corner of the desk on the left hand side of the image. I wanted to just include another object to just highlight that it really doesn't have to be flowers that you photograph, it can be anything. So here I have a toy dinosaur I stole from my nephew. I've also included some of the annotation notes by the side and also the rule of thirds grid, so you can see how I've lined up the image. For this one, I've decided to add material in the background, and I feel like this has helped add texture, and that texture does fill in the rule of thirds, helping me to compose the frame. I've also found that this texture was a nice contrasting colour to the dinosaur, which helped the colours pop in the dinosaur, which I think works really well. The material also helps add depth, so you can see in the bottom left hand corner the material is slightly out of focus. This helps add depth to the image. You can see the dinosaur is in focus, so it creates a dynamic composition there. So I was quite happy with how that turned out for that reason. I would like you to add some annotation notes for your final image, please guys. Exactly as I have done in the previous slides, I want you to write about your thought process. And this includes the camera function, talk about the exposure and the focus when you tap the screen. Why was you tapping, where you tapped, how did you control that element? What camera function did you use and why? Add it in. Talk about the lighting, the source, the quality, the direction, what impact it has. The composition. Explain to me how the rule of thirds works. Tell me about your orientation choice. Did you do landscape or portrait? Talk about the framing. What did you add in a frame? What did you take out? Everything is really important to this. Talk about the angle, where you shot from, were you far away, close up, high, down low? And lastly, the background. Are there any colours you added or taken away? Was there any textures you think complement your subject? Also, add in your personal thoughts. Let me know what you thought worked well and what didn't. Maybe areas you can improve on. Remember, annotating is a part of your coursework, so it's an important process to include as part of your work. I don't want to see just photographs. I want to see writing to show me you understand why you've made the decisions that you have in today's lesson. By the end of today's lesson, I want us all to be able to relate to the success criteria and be able to say these 3 statements. I have shared my knowledge of photography in the worksheet before the lesson. I have created a range of images by controlling the functions and settings within my camera and experimented with different photography techniques. And then lastly, I want you to be able to say that you've created a final image that demonstrates an understanding of the rule of thirds, lighting, angles, colours and textures, and explained my choices with annotated notes. So for today's lesson, I'm looking for you to hand in these things on the screen now. Firstly, a worksheet. I want to see your answers to those, please. Then the photo tasks. It might be easy to add your photos into a Word document and include the notes underneath each image on the Word document. Then lastly, I want to see your final image with your annotated notes. So please hand in all these 3 things. I look forward to seeing your work and catch up with you soon.